What's up, everybody? I'm Thomas J. Bellezza, and welcome to The Right Mindset. Today, we are going to go over what is an antagonist in a story, specifically your story. So let's go. We're going to break down a couple of things of what makes an antagonist, and ultimately, what is an antagonist, and how can you utilize it in your story. Let's hit that intro, shall we? As always, a big massive thank you to everyone that's joined me up into this far of the journey. But if you're new here or you've been following along and you like what you're hearing, please subscribe to the channel. And remember to hit that bell icon so you don't miss out. Let's get right into it. As I said, today's lesson is about what is an antagonist in a story, which means we have to, as an individual, know exactly what is an antagonist in general. An antagonist in literature is the principal opponent or foil of the main character or the protagonist, protagoni, if there's more than one, in a drama or narrative. Again, an antagonist in an antagonist in literature is the principal opponent or foil of the main character, the protagonist, in a drama or narrative. Okay. You may think of an antagonist as Darth Vader, but depending on how you view the story, these movies, or the emotional arc, it can change. That's right. So if you're writing a novel or a script or whatever it is, an antagonist does not necessarily have to be a villain, right? So one thing that might be confusing is the idea that the antagonists are also evil, but that isn't necessarily true. An antagonist is not really evil per se. They are characters who have opposing actions, views, motivations, ideals, thoughts, etc. to the main character, who should be your protagonist in the story. Does that make them evil? It could, but it doesn't. When you're writing an antagonist, they don't necessarily have to be evil. They just need to have an opposing view. I mean, in a romantic comedy, or a love story, the antagonist isn't necessarily an evil person because it's a love story. It's a romantic comedy. Maybe, try to look at your antagonist as something more than just a villain. It'll add some depth to your stories as well. So think of your story's antagonist as a simple a broken down version of what a plot role would be. What is the role of the antagonist or the antagonistic force in your story, and how do you build on that? You can see that an antagonist is one that contends with or opposes another, in this case, the protagonist, right? This adversary comes in different forms. Maybe they are a political opponent, thus making them an antagonist. So again, two people are running for office. They both may not be evil. They might both be evil. But being evil does not make them an antagonist. Whoever the perspective of the story is coming from, or the protagonist of your story, the opposing force would be their antagonist. Their battle for sanity as an individual is the antagonist, or it's more physical than that. Your character might be dealing with an injury or an accident that basically immobilizes them, and they have to figure out a way to push back towards life and find some rhythm or purpose or normality in their existence again. And in this situation, the antagonist might be their newly formed I don't know if they call it disability still, but they're handy capable or I apologize. I don't know what the term is. I grew up. It's a disability. Like, my dad had a disability. He had a blown up leg, and he had PTSD and some other things. So he had a disability, a physical disability in his leg, right? So that technically could have been his antagonist for his storyline. For example, when he got out of Vietnam, they were saying there's nothing wrong with your leg, and he's like, there's pain. And then years later, they finally agreed to do the operation, and they said that it was the Army's fault. And on the operation table, his patella, his kneecap, literally turned to dust in the doctor's hand. So that's, what I'm saying, like a disability or an injury can be a newly formed injury, could technically be an antagonist. You know, and that could be anything from a muscle tear to losing your arm or leg, or even placed in a coma. Maybe you're placed in a coma and you're living out the story in that world, right? And you might not necessarily be dreaming, because they say that people in comas sometimes can hear what's going on. So we get to live the existence of that character through that. So, but ultimately, what is an antagonist? Because we need to understand that. To simplify it and put it into a straight sentence, an antagonist is an element in your story that pushes back on the protagonist to challenge them. Again, an antagonist is an element in your story that pushes back on the protagonist to challenge them. I think it's time we give some examples of an antagonistic force so we can really kind of understand it. The go-to traditionally, especially for a hero-esque story, is a villain. The bad guy we all know and love. Captain Hook in Peter Pan is a villain, as well as Simon Gruber from Die Hard with a Vengeance. Right? Why is that a villain? Well, he is the conflict creator. He literally, Simon says, he puts the protagonist into situations where he's being challenged, right? That's what makes writing so much fun, is that an antagonist, but that's the thing, like, the antagonist doesn't have to be a bad guy, right? With Die Hard with a Vengeance, he's a straight up bad guy, but he had other motivations, really. His sub motivation was to torture John, or Bruce Willis's character, right? But at the same time, he really wanted to steal gold. Spoiler alert, right? But as a writer, the fun part is that it doesn't mean that the antagonist has to be a bad guy. Sometimes they're just a character whose goals are in different conflict with the protagonist. What's an example of that? Severus Snape is a bad guy, but pushes I'm saying he isn't a bad guy, but pushes back on Harry. He's an antagonist because, as a professor, as a character, he's constantly watching Harry. He's pushing Harry. He's on Harry's. He's always on Harry, right? But Buzz Lightyear is a hero by definition on the packaging of his existence, but not in the first Toy Story. In the first Toy Story, Buzz Lightyear is the antagonist to Woody, because Woody is the protagonist. Because he's making Woody's life a living hell. And by no means of his own existence, but that he's the new toy. He's the new exciting toy. And that almost takes us to another level, that the antagonistic force is just the nature of growing out of things for children, But now you get into a nature of it all, too, as an antagonist. Those inanimate forces that act as the antagonists. A volcano, the sea itself in some cases. It's just making it that the antagonist is not necessarily human in that moment. Your antagonist is literally a force of nature. It's something out there pushing back on your protagonist. I'm not sure you saw this, but tomorrow, what was it called? Tomorrow, movie about the cold called Tomorrow. The end of tomorrow, right? The day after tomorrow. The day after tomorrow is an example of nature being an antagonist in that situation. Okay. It's a force against. It's a literal force against the protagonist. Twister. I mean, that movie, The Twisters, could technically be the antagonist. Even in Castaway, when Tom Hanks's character is in Castaway, the antagonist is technically that storm, the ocean, the island, and the protagonist is fighting against the island to survive, fighting against their situation to survive, right? There's no malicious villain fighting to make Tom Hanks's character in that movie life a living hell. In fact, there's no malicious intent in destroying the plane, forcing the plane to crash to get rid of Tom Hanks's character. It's just things happen, right? Another example of force being the antagonist is when there is no clear physical force, but the character is forced through the workings of anti-Asian or other racism that filters through the area. Um, now, you might be thinking, well, if a character is racist, they could be the antagonist. What I'm saying here as an example is the movement of racism. Like if you go into a city or a town, usually it's a town in the South, right? In stories, they're like, "Oh, we're in Alabama, and we're all racist," right? That's whatever. Not that that's how Alabamians sound, but maybe the town itself is racist, and there's a character. I mean, what's the movie that Get Out? Get Out. It's a great example. Racism was ultimately the antagonist. It was driving the force of that community to do what they did. Yes, each individual had their levels of racism and their level of antagonistic energy, but ultimately that town was fueled by racism. Okay. If all the problems in the protagonist's life stem from racism pushing back on them, that is ultimately the antagonist. They have to fight through that oppression, right? Now, the part where we say that the protagonists themselves can be their worst nightmare, we're going into the internal, the subconscious, the mind, right? This is now the part where we say that the protagonists themselves can be their worst nightmare is ultimately if the main source of conflict in your story comes from within your protagonist, that becomes the antagonist. This could be anything from insecurities that keep them from reaching their goals, right? They're their own glass ceiling, one might say, right? If you are going to have a character where they suffer from PTSD. PTSD in that situation may be considered the antagonist, but it's what they are dealing with internally, so they themselves become their own antagonist. They are working towards finding some sort of way to break through what's happening to them emotionally and mentally, and their health is in danger, right? Another thing is if you are going to have a story that doesn't have an external antagonizing force, rather the conflict is within the protagonist, you want to have a strong backstory that help fuel that inner conflict, who they are, what haunts them, etc. So if PTSD is really the defining element of the antagonistic force for the protagonist, you might want to establish why that is. It helps add some value to it. If they have insecurities, we might want to explore those insecurities. Honestly, if you've seen Moon Knight, there is a defining villain antagonist force in that show. However, the protagonist also is dealing with I don't want to say this. I call it multiple personalities because that's what, but that's not what it is. It's dissociate identity disorder, I believe. Dissociate identity disorder. It might be. Again, I apologize if I'm going off the top of my head of like things I know. But he's dealing with these other entities, these other personalities as a way of dealing with a lot of trauma or ways to protect himself, etc., etc. And those are also antagonistic forces. So one might even say in that show there are multiple antagonistic forces, which makes you think, oh, in my story, I can have multiple antagonistic forces. And you can, you're allowed to. It's your story. Um, so let's get to final thoughts and really talk about what is an antagonist, right? When in doubt, think of it as man versus animal, man versus self, man versus setting, man versus society, man versus supernatural, man versus technology, or man versus weather. While you're coming up with character ideas, or even if you have a protagonist and you have a general character that you're like, I want to tell the story of this particular entity, and you might come up with a quote unquote villain antagonist. You might be like, you know what, somebody they went to college with, right? You know, the Reed Richards and Victor Von Doom storyline where they did go to college together, right? In the comics, whatever. I could be 100% off on that, but as far as I know, they did know each other. But anyway, that could be true. That could be what you start out with. Allow yourself, though, to really brainstorm on your stories. Allow yourself to say, what can I do to make this antagonist more than just a villain, right? And think of those things. How can I, man versus animal, man versus nature, man versus self? You might even be, as I said, you can have multiple antagonistic forces. So if Victor Von Doom is Reed Rich's antagonistic force because he's the villain, you can clean up the fact that he's a villain and make him more of a three-dimensional character that has his or her own motivations, and that maybe Victor Von Doom isn't a direct antagonist to Reed Richards. It's just that they both want, say, Sue Storm. I think in one of the movies that was like the thing was Victor Von in the original, well, not the original one, but the one that Fox made. They both like Sue Storm. So really, that was the antagonistic force. Was they both wanted Sue Storm, but they weren't really like. He wasn't like, I want to kill Reed Richards. You know, he still respected Reed Richards, but he was in love with Sue Storm, right? So it's okay to be like, well, how do I take a step back from being a villain and make it a little bit more interesting? And maybe you have the villain and you go, what are other elements? How can I make this protagonist have something about themselves, or they're somebody that's close to them, or maybe the setting is difficult. Maybe they're thrown into an area where they grew up on the beaches, but the story takes place where they're forced to be put into a more Arctic area, you know, and they have a Victor Von Doom or somebody that they're dealing with too, and that person also likes somebody they like, and you know the society that they're in doesn't like outsiders, and they're both outsiders, the protagonist, the antagonist, and the love interest. So now there's like so many different elements to the antagonistic force. So it's good. And don't get me wrong, there is nothing wrong with having your antagonist be a big, bad, evil, scary villain. I should have a counter to be like how many times I do. Anyway, some of the best stories are simple. There is a hero, and they have a villain, right? Over there, twirling their facial hair, you know, going, I am the villain, right? If you want a powerful wizard trying to take over the world, or a bank robber holding everyone hostage while they plan to escape, do it. Do it. Right? It's your story. It's always going to be your story. So if someone's like, you know, I'm sick and tired of villain, you know, antagonists, and you're like, yeah, but I have a story where there's a villain. Write your story. Remember, creatively, you create for you. You write for you. You build these worlds for you first. Whatever you're passionate about, you do first for you. Once you want to make money on it, then you have to package it. But packaging what you love, what you wrote, what you care about is a lot easier than going, what does X want or what does Y want? If you focus the creativity on you first, from your passions, from the things that are important, the stories you want to tell, then packaging that is a lot easier than you think. Because branding is all about, it starts with you, and it's an emotional connection with your audience. Ergo, Stephen King puts his name And people go, I know Stephen King's brand. I know what he's about. I know his themes, right? That he likes to write about. Anyway, my only suggestion, though, when you're working on your story is when you're looking to shake things up, take that villain and add some layers to it, as I said earlier, and make it more than they want to rule the world and shoot a big blue light into the sky. Now, personally, I am working on as they call it, as the kids call it, a whip, a work in progress, process. Progress. I'm working on a piece. I'm literally like, I've been doing these videos all day. All right, so I like the film in batches. So, in my whip, it looks like they're trying to take over the world. It looks like they're trying to control the world, and not to give anything away, I like the idea of subverting expectations. I like the idea of saying this is the story you think you're getting. However, there's a lot of clues, a lot of notes, a lot of emotional truths, and a lot of seeding that really, if you discover the twist or whatever happens, you could go back and be like, there it is. I saw it coming. It's always been there. Fun fact, today is 11/23/2022, not the day this video is posted. However, if you watch it and you go, hey, I bought this book, and you watch this video, you'd be like, oh my God, he made this video before the book came out, and it's an interesting little, I know what he's talking about because I read the book. Anyway, all right. But when I say make it more than they want to take over the world because of that big blue light shooting in the sky, your antagonist is going to be what defines the struggle for your protagonist. An antagonistic force is as important as the protagonist's motivations, right? It's the pushback, which means your antagonist needs to be a worthy opponent, whether it's nature or not. They have to be challenged. Your protagonist needs to be challenged by this antagonistic force. Whatever you go with, though, make sure they are more than an afterthought and absolutely add to the main plot or some of the subplots. The next video in the series will go over how to make your antagonistic force that said worthy conflict to your protagonist. Ultimately, the video is going to be focusing on how to take an antagonistic idea and make it a worthy component to your story that pushes back on your protagonist and adds some conflict, tension, and interesting moments for your protagonist to make choices, because we all know story is about choice. That's how we connect with our characters, is what they do or do not do, say or do not say, and the things they do or do not do in the sense of, are they active or passive, right? My question to you, though, is who's your favorite antagonistic force in a story? And it doesn't have to be a villain. It could be any form of an antagonistic force. However, I mean, who doesn't love Darth Vader? Let me know in the comments below. We can start a discussion. Beep. Want to learn a little bit more about improving your craft, insight on the industry, and hearing from fellow authors, as we have the Right Mindset podcasts episodes where we speak with other authors who are in the industry in all levels. And you can discover a little bit about their process of writing, craft in general, the insights of the business of their world, like how they deal with it, their perspective of it, and a couple other little things, But anyway, please subscribe and hit that bell icon so you don't miss out. Oh, this was a fun episode. I had fun. Whew. As always, keep developing the right mindset. I'll see you next time.